Hey programmers, welcome back. Right now it's time for an exercise. Let's go ahead and do the A nested loops exercise and utilize what we learned in the last lecture. So if you haven't already, what you want to do is pause this video, go down to the link in the description and give this exercise a shot on your own. And if you get stuck, come back to this walkthrough, right? Or maybe you even finished the exercise and just want to watch me solve it. And so here's what we'll do. Let me go ahead and set up my environment. I'll create a nice folder and I'll have all of these snippets ready to go. So looking at part 0, looks like what I have to do is just predict the output for some nested loop snippets. Let me get that set up. All right, so looking at snippet 1, I just have some very basic nested loops. So if I look at the outer loop, I know it's going to print out 1 through 4, and it looks like the inner loop prints out 1 through 3. And it looks like my console.log lies actually within my inner loop, right? So the total number of lines I should print out is really just 12, right? Because I should just do 4 times 3. And in particular, the pattern of my output will be something like 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and then 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, right? So let's run this code. Remember that every left-hand number, that is the I, won't change very quick, but the J's will change pretty quick, right? So let me run this code and verify my guess. Looks like I need to cd into my folder. Then I can run snippet 1. Right, and there we have it. Again, the key pattern to understand for your nested loops is kind of from one iteration to the next, your outer counter, that is your I, is going to stay still as you hit every J. And once you're done iterating through all the J's, then you finally move down your I and continue in that order. So nothing too fancy there. Let's go ahead to the second snippet. So looking at my second snippet, I have some very similar behavior. The first thing I'll recognize is in terms of how my counters range, it looks like my outer one goes from 0 up to n including just 1, right? Because it's strictly less than 2. And my inner counter starts at 0, goes up to n including 4, right? Because again, it's exclusive over here. And if I look at how my console.logs are laid out, I'll notice that my n is printed out just inside of my outer loop, right? N is not printed out inside of the inner loop. And in particular, it looks like n is going to be printed out before I start my inner loop, as well as after I start my inner loop. So I should expect my n counters to kind of wrap the output for my inner loop, right? It looks like every m that is printed out is just going to be indented as well, right? So I'm going to start with n is equal to 0 over here, and then I'm going to iterate completely all the way through my m. So that'll give me 0 up to and including 4. Then after that, I'm going to print out n equals to 0 again. Then after that's done, I print out n equals 1, and then 0 through 4 as m, and then I print out n equals 1 once again, right? So I should get like a little sandwich of output each time. So let me go ahead and run this code. And there we have it. Notice that your n's kind of sandwich your values for m over here, right? Just because they lie relative around the inner loop. So let's keep it rolling. Let's go on to snippet 3. Looks like now we work in some array logic over here. And so if I look at this code, I have 2 loops. They have distinct counters, so that's good. And they also iterate through the same array. And recall, whenever we have this kind of generic pattern, that tends to give you all pairs of elements in an array, right? So in the first iteration, if I set I equal to 0 and j equal to 0, it's going to print the same element twice. So that should just print out Philip, Philip. Then I must increment my inner loop j, so now j is 1, so that'll give me Philip, Abby, and so on, right? So this gives me all pairs of elements printed out, including the duplicate pairs, right? So I'm going to have self-duplicates like Philip, Philip, and also ordered duplicates like Philip, Abby, and then later on, Abby, Philip, right? Because we just wrote very, very basic for loops that individually iterate all the way through the array. And now we can compare that to snippet 4, where we have very similar code. We have a different array, but more importantly, our inner loop uses that unique pair pattern, right? Where we set j equal to I plus 1, right? Recall what we just covered in the last lecture. So just from the outset, I know that on my very first iteration, the first time this console.log is hit, I know that I is equal to 0 and j is equal to 1, right? Because I do 0 plus 1. So that gives me Flatbush, comma, Wilmsburg. Then from there, I get Flatbush, Bushwick, and so on. And so this will give me all unique pairs of elements in this array. Nice. So moving on to snippet 5, we have an array and we have nested loops, but let's try to take a lay of the land and see how these loops are actually designed. So I know that my outer loop, that is my I loop, will just iterate through every individual element of this array. So we'll go like red, purple, orange, right? So we're just going to print out that entire string. And then my inner loop iterates from j equals 0 up to but not including the length of the color string variable, which is the string we just printed out. Right? And then it just looks like they print out every individual character of that string. So what I expect to see is, in terms of my console.logs, On every iteration, I'm going to print out the word all at once, so red, and then after that, the individual characters of red, so R-E-D. And I'm going to print out purple as one line, and then the individual characters of P-U-R-P-L-E, right, and so on. So it's totally fine to write nested loops that kind of iterate through anything you want, right? So my outer loop iterates through elements of an array, while my inner loop iterates through strings. So let me run this code. Here's my snippet 5. Just like we said, right, we print out the entire word all at once, and then individual characters every single time. All right, so that was a nice warm up for these prediction exercises for loops, but now let's go ahead to actually writing some functions for ourselves. So it looks like my first problem is pair print, and I can probably already gather what pattern I need to use here. Good motion to go through. So write a function pair print that accepts an array as an argument. The function should print out all unique pairs of elements, so that's super important, in the array. The function does not need to return, it just needs to print out some data. Looks like my function should be able to handle any array that it's given, right? And so let's go ahead and jump into this code. And while we're here, I kind of will also notice that in terms of the output, looks like they want like a hyphen to separate my different strings. So I'll just keep that in mind. But let me start defining this function. So I'll say let pair print. It's going to be a function who expects an array. And I know to get this like pair pattern, I'm going to need nested loops. So I'm going to just start with a single for loop in the classic sense. So I know that this loop by itself will grab elements of the array, right? So I'll grab array at index I, and I'll just print those out. Let me just say I ran the first example. Let me move this down over here, and we'll give it a go. Well, now I want to build up this solution as always, right? So there I see my single elements printed out. But now for every element that I print out over here, what I want to do is kind of compare it to the other elements of the array, right? So I'll need to use another loop to do that. So let me just go ahead and nest another loop inside. I'll kind of copy this down. And I need to be sure to change my counters, right? So instead of I, my inner loop, I'll say J. Just a very common convention. I think really just because J comes after I, right? And then from there, I want to print out my pairs all together, kind of like in this pattern. So what I'll say is in my single console.log that is inside of both loops, that is inside of the inner loop really, I'll print out I, and I'll add a hyphen, just doing some string concatenation. And I'll also add on J. So let's just run this first example and see what we get. And you'll probably notice that we're kind of missing a bit of the required logic here. Let's run it. So I see a lot of pairs printed out, right? I see way more pairs than we should have printed out, right? I have self pairs and I have my ordered pairs, right? I have artichoke, artichoke, and then something like artichoke, broccoli, and then broccoli, artichoke over here. And they did specify in the question that they want unique pairs. So I need to use the trick. And so I don't want to begin j equal to 0 because that would give me a self pair, right? If I set I equal to 0 and j equals 0, that means I have artichoke, artichoke from the get, which is not something I want. Instead, I need to make sure that j starts 1 greater than I at all times, right? And this will give me all of my unique pairs, very similar to what we did previously. So again, what's the trick for understanding this little logic over here? Well, if we write code like this, we're always ensuring that j is going to be greater than I, right? Because I know that, hey, j begins at 1 greater than I, and j only gets bigger from there, right? So at any point in time, j is bigger than I, which means that j will never refer to an element that I referred to previously, right? So let's go ahead and run this second example as well. Looks like we have an array of just 3 elements. I should get very similar behavior. There I see it over here. These are all unique pairs of elements of this apple, banana, clementine array. All right, so that was some pair print logic. Let's go ahead and do print combinations. And this one's pretty interesting because it takes in 2 arrays. So let me work on this code. So it looks like my function takes in 2 arrays as arguments. What I want to do is print out all combination of elements generated by taking an element from the first array and also an element from the second array. So if I look at the first example here, I have an array of colors at the start, so gray, cream, and cyan. I also have an array of clothes of shirt and flannel. And what I do is print out like every combination across these 2 arrays. So I have a gray shirt, a gray flannel, and that kind of comes from this pattern, right? Doing gray shirt and gray flannel. Then I have a cream shirt, cream flannel, and then finally cyan shirt and cyan flannel, right? So I definitely have the feeling of like pairs over here, but what I'll have to recognize is now it's not pairs within the same array, but it kind of pairs from 2 different arrays, kind of across the 2 arrays. I have a very similar pattern for the second example over here. So I don't think this one will be too dissimilar from what we did with our previous pair print problem, except I just need to reference different arrays, right? So let me work on this code. So I'll start defining my print combinations, and it's going to be a function, takes in two things. We'll just call it array1 and array2. And let's jump right inside. So what I want to do is just start by iterating through my first loop. So very, very classic for loop. I'm sure you're sick of these loops by now. Don't worry, we'll learn new stuff as we move forward, but I always think it's important to practice a pattern to death, right? That way you can do these things when you need them most, like when you're building an application, or more importantly, when you're looking for a job, right? I hope that all of you get jobs from this course I'm building, right? So I'll iterate while I is less than array1.length. So that'll give me every first element, and of course, that will be from array1. So I'll do array1 at index I. Maybe this time around, I'll just use some separate variables. So maybe I'll say something like le1 is coming from array1. Then I'll write a very similar for loop to grab elements from the second array, right? So that means over here, I can kind of manipulate this loop, and I'll make sure that it iterates through some j's. So I'll be sure to change all of these. And I'll hit array2, right? Do j++. And then from there, grab your le2 as array2j. And then all I want to do is just print out both of these things, right? So inside of my inner loop, I'll be sure to console.log my le1 with a space and then le2, right? So I could just do something like le1, comma, le2. Recalling that if I pass multiple arguments into console.log, it gives me a nice space between them. And so something I do want to emphasize about your code, especially as our code gets more and more complex, in particular, more and more nested, it's really important that you properly indent your code, right? Because I have my code indented properly over here. It's very obvious to see where my code lies, right? So I can easily identify that, hey, this console.log is inside of my inner loop, right? Things are less obvious if you don't do proper indentation, right? Basically, the rule of thumb is wherever we have like some curly braces and we open up like a code body, we add a level of indent, right? So I have a level of indent for my function, then also a level of indent for this outer loop, then another level of indent for my inner loop, right? If you did not indent, this code becomes very, very unreadable. And so proper indentation is really like the number one free tip that I give to like new programmers because it's so important. It probably feels like a chore at the start, but trust me, you will make mistakes if you follow bad style, right? So hold yourself to a high standard, and plus it's just best practice when it comes to programming, right? And so let's go ahead and run this code, and I'll just run the first example, I think. So let's give this a go, print combinations. And there I see my gray shirt, gray flannel, cream shirt, cream flannel, and cyan shirt, cyan flannel. Something I want to emphasize in this code is, of course, we're kind of generating pairs across arrays, and because they're different arrays, right? It's okay that I set I equal to 0 and j equal to 0, because that gives me still a unique pair like gray shirt, right? Because remember, I have two distinct arrays. I believe that we're also able to solve the second example over here, right? I have hot soup, hot tea, and cold soup, cold tea. So that's a nice little spinoff of the pair pattern. Hopefully you've internalized this pattern, right? You could accomplish a lot of cool things, a lot of programming, and solving new problems is just recognizing where it's similar to previous problems that you've solved, right? So let's keep it rolling. Let's go to the last problem over here, to sum. And this is a variation of a very, very famous coding problem. And it's famous in that it's a fairly common like interview style problem in terms of like companies screening people out of their process, right? So typically if you can't solve this problem, then you're probably not ready for a developer job, right? And you guys are already doing this problem, and you're basically still beginners, which I think is really, really awesome, right? So let's get this problem under our belts now. And so what do we want to do in this problem? This problem is a little more involved. So I'm taking in two arguments, an array of numbers, as well as a single target number, right? What I want to do is return a Boolean, so true or false, indicating whether or not there exists a pair of distinct elements in the array that sum to my target, right? So basically I'm saying, hey, given this array over here, are there two elements that sum to 7? And in the first example, I say that's true because how can I generate 7? Well, you can take the 2 plus the 5, right? 2 plus 5 gives me 7, so that's a true. However, if I switch things up and I gave you the same array, but now your target sum was 4, it's actually false, right? You can't generate 4 by adding some two numbers of this array, right? There's no two numbers that exist in this array that when you add them, you can get a 4. I look at this third example, how can I get 10? Well, you just did a 6 plus 4, right? And so from this problem, whenever you have a sense of pairs, I think the first thing to leap toward is probably nested loops. And then I can begin adding more logic into my code, right? But for now, let me at least establish that familiar pattern of pair finding, right? So let me define toSum. And we'll take in our array of numbers and our target. And if I just want to, let's say, grab pairs at the start, I know to use some nested loops. Let me just bang out those nested loops that both iterate through numbers. Now that I have my core nested loops down, what I want to do is kind of take a cue from the problem. Here they say I should be comparing distinct elements in the array, right? Distinct also means unique. So what I want to do is that trick of set j equal to I plus 1. And we'll kind of return to why that's really important in this problem, right? Maybe you kind of didn't notice that little hint and you set I equal to 0 and j equal to 0. And I'll show you in a bit why that will fail. But for now, let me do it the correct way. And so what I'll do is inside of my nested loops, I have to consider some logic I want to do, right? So I know that if I just like console.logged my two numbers here, so let's say I console.log numbers at index I, as well as numbers at index j, I have the ability to at least consider every pair of elements. Let me just run this first example. So I just kind of have these two elements in my hand, right? Of course, we're getting undefined over here as that final console.log from this line because our function doesn't return anything, right? Just some classic undefined behavior over there. But now that I have a pair of numbers like 2, 3, and 2, 5, and 2, 9, I want to check something, right? I want to check a condition. So I can totally put an if statement inside of these nested loops, right? So let me actually check, hey, if I add these two numbers, maybe I'll just steal this code. If I add numbers at index I, as well as numbers at index j, if that sum is equal to my target, that means I'm in business, right? And that should be something that I return true for. So over here, I'll just say return true, right? So if ever I find a pair of numbers that sums to my target, then return true because that means I'm done, right? As always, when I hit a return line, that means I immediately exit the function, which in this problem is totally fine because you just found a pair, right? The first pair you find validates the entire function. Right? But then that begs the question, where should we return false, right? And so the key here is to return false after your nested loops, right? So if my nested for loops have the job of like iterating through all pairs of elements in the array, when have I actually checked all pairs of elements? That would be after the for loops. If I get to this code over here and I have never returned true, then it must be the case that there does not exist any pair that sums to my target. So over here, I'll return false. So let's run the first example and we'll see what we get. Let me clear this properly. So true, and I'll run all of them. Should get true, false, true, false. Nice. And then we have a good solution to toSum. So now that we have the correct solution laid out, let me show you a few common mistakes that you may run into, right? So let's say I really focus my attention to the second example over here. Looking at the second example, the correct answer is false because there isn't a way to generate 4 by adding up two different elements from this array. However, if you made the mistake of setting j equal to 0, you know that that will yield duplicate pairs. So I'll have at the start a self-duplicate like comparing 2 to itself. So that means in my if statement, I'm going to do 2 plus 2, and then it happens to equal to 4. So then you return incorrectly true, right? So that's why I want to have distinct elements considered over here by setting j equal to I plus 1. If you don't use unique pairs, then that means sometimes you're going to take the same element and add it to itself, right? Which is not something I want over here based on the example and the description. So let me bring this back to the proper code, right? So this should be working now again. Awesome. And another common mistake is actually writing your return false in the incorrect place. So let's say I bring in just the first example, right? So if I run this code, the first example should return true because the pair that satisfies 7 would be the 2 plus the 5, right? Let's say that I did my return false incorrectly. And a very common thing I see is we have this tendency as just like programmers, when we have like if some condition return true, then like, oh, we should definitely write like an else, do the opposite of like returning false, right? It's very easy to kind of fall into that trap, right? Just doing the opposite thing and always having an else statement. But let's think about it now, right? So when I see code like this, even without like understanding the problem, just looking at the code for its overall behavior, I know that this code is kind of silly. And why is that? Well, I have nested for loops. I know that they iterate, right? They are going to have many iterations. However, when I have an if-else statement like this, I know that I'm either going to enter the if or I'm going to enter the else. And so that means dependent on some condition, I'm going to return, right? I don't even care what I'm returning right now, just understanding that if I return, I exit my entire function. So that means you're guaranteed to exit your entire function after a single iteration, which seems fishy, right? What was even the point of writing nested loops if you're just going to exit after just one iteration, right? But let's say we ran this code, right? Now I'm getting the incorrect result for the very first example, because of exactly what we wrote. So on the first iteration, I'm going to consider a pair of elements, and I know that I'm going to be considering 2 and 3, because remember we set j equal to I plus 1. So when I is 0, index 0, that means j is going to be index 1. So I do 2 plus 3 over here, and I check, is 2 plus 3 equal to 7? So is 5 equal to 7? That's false, and if this condition is false, that means you enter this else statement and you return false. Right, which is incorrect, right? You returned false and you basically said that, hey, there is no pair of elements that adds to my target, but you didn't even check all pairs of elements, right? You just verified a single pair and then did a preemptive return false, right? So that's why we want to actually move this return false to after the nested loops, right? Try to understand your code and its patterns for like what they do, like what purpose they serve, right? So as a kind of total unit, these nested loops check all pairs of elements in the array. So only after I've checked all pairs of elements in the array can I finally say that, hey, there were no elements that add up to my target. So that means my return false comes after these nested loops over here. All right, so I think that wraps up this exercise. So what I want you to do is if you had any issues or just want to practice more on these problems, I recommend you repeat the problem set on your own. And once you can do it totally on your own without referencing this video walkthrough, then move on to the next video where we're going to actually learn a pretty new concept.